He who would become a surgeon should join the army and follow it. So Hippocrates, father of medicine, counseled nearly 2,500 years ago. If war has a silver lining, perhaps this is it, as the ultimate hands-on classroom in raw anatomy and mutilated flesh. A horrific classroom that teaches above all what the human species has been willing to do to itself. There is something paradoxical about the very idea of battlefield medicine, about armies and individuals desperately trying to kill and rescue at the same time.
Louis Pasteur, the famous scientist, said that there are two forces in this world that are constantly at play. One is the force of always designing new weapons of destruction, and some of them of mass destruction, and the other force is always trying to find new cures for diseases and how to save lives. And he said which one of these forces will win out at the end, God alone knows.
It may seem like mass destruction has gotten the upper hand. Modern weapons make the very notion of battlefield medicine seem obsolete. But the weapons and strategies of rescue have also evolved, benefiting at times from the same technology that propels the slaughter. The history of battlefield medicine is almost as old as the history of organized war. 1,000 years before the birth of Christ, the legendary Greek hero Achilles took time to bandage the wounds of his comrade Patroclus during the Trojan War. According to Homer, ancient soldiers rarely survived their wounds. 192 of the 213 casualties he described in the Iliad died. Things improved dramatically in the Roman Empire, where soldiers enjoyed such good battlefield care that they lived 5 years longer than civilians.
The Roman military medical system was without question the most developed in the ancient world. In fact, it would not see its equal for over a millennium. It's very clear from evidence like Trajan's column that there are soldiers who are assigned to care for their colleagues during and or after the battle. There's also evidence that there were physicians attached to legions, suggesting a hierarchical system of care back through the chain of evacuation.
All that disappeared during the Dark Ages, when armies organized nothing for the wounded. During the Crusades, knights either brought their own physicians to battle or were left to die where they fell. Gunpowder, first used in 1325, created ghastly new wounds and a new urgency for military surgery. But ignorance led to appalling procedures. Gunpowder wounds were considered poisonous and treated accordingly.
You have to get rid of the poison. Heat is usually the best way to overcome a poison, and so cautery, boiling oil, other fairly heroic approaches were taken to treating these wounds.
Boiling oil or cautery with a hot iron tended to destroy tissue. And by the 14th century, amputees were a familiar part of the European landscape. This wound man, riddled with knife, sword, axe, arrow, truncheon, and gunball wounds to major arteries, was used to train 16th century battlefield surgeons. The most celebrated was a Frenchman named Ambrose Paré. It was Paré who sometimes performed surgeries in the midst of battle, who revolutionized the treatment of gunshot wounds using herbal salves instead of boiling oil. In addition, he devised pioneering techniques in amputation and hemorrhage control, and even ventured into plastic surgery, designing replacement noses complete with mustache. Modern combat medicine begins with the French Revolution and a doctor named Dominique Jean Larrey.
The big thing that Larrey did, beyond organization, beyond being a great surgeon, was he brought the surgeon to the soldier. He didn't have the surgeon sit and wait till somebody dragged the soldier to him.
To that end, Larrey devised the ambulance volante, or flying ambulance, which could whisk casualties out of harm's way. He also created teams of ambulance drivers and litter bearers whose sole duty was to find wounded men and bring them to safety.
The treatment occurs much sooner, hours, sometimes days sooner, in a profession where hours make a difference between life and death.
The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century created new possibilities for mass destruction. Statistically, the American Civil War was the most life-threatening war of all time. A quarter of those wounded in action died, 620,000 in all. 130,000 men were disfigured for life. 50,000 were amputees. A new bullet, the mini ball, conically shaped and 3 times larger than the musket ball, was responsible for much of the carnage.
When the mini ball hit flesh, it caused a rapidly expanding wound so that you could put your fist in the hole where it came out sometime. It would shatter bones and leave wounds unlike anything surgeons had seen in their civilian practices.
Because of the severity of the wounds and the danger of infection, a shot to the limbs meant almost certain amputation.
90% of the legs or arms that were injured with ballistics had to be amputated. Only if it was just a flesh wound, up to 20 to 30% of people died.
As the war progressed, field surgeons became adept at hacking off limbs in under a minute. A morning's work is the ironic title of this Union photo. Just years away from the germ theory of disease, amputations were performed with little concern for cleanliness.
There wasn't much time, and so a surgeon would change an apron when it was so bloody as to mess up his own clothes. If his knife got dull, he would strop it on the nearest available leather, perhaps his boot, because there was no reason not to, and it saved time, and time was obviously crucial.
Recuperation in a permanent hospital was equally hazardous. It was 7 times safer to fight through all 3 days of Gettysburg, an Army sergeant wrote, than to have an arm or leg cut off and be treated in a hospital. Recently discovered anesthetics like ether and chloroform were in short supply, and fully half the amputations were done to conscious soldiers. Quack medicines abounded, like Dolly's magical pain extractor, or Holloway's pills, promising health for the soldier. Disease, as in all wars to that time, claimed far more lives than guns. Malaria, typhoid fever, and dysentery swept through the Union and rebel armies, composed largely of farm boys who caught every bug that camp life and battlefield could offer. Worst of all, as the war began, neither side was remotely prepared for dealing with massive casualties. The North had less than 100 doctors on staff, and no strategy for evacuation or casualty care.
The first big battle, Manassas Bull Run, in July of 1861, patients were left on the battlefield on Union side up to a week before they were picked up. And there were no general hospitals, there were no field hospitals. Regimental surgeons had not been instructed. There was, in short, no system for taking care of the wounded.
A system came, unexpectedly, courtesy of a 37-year-old doctor named Jonathan Letterman, who was put in charge of medical care for the Army of the Potomac in 1862. Building on the innovations of the Frenchman Larrey, Letterman improved upon the ambulance corps, replaced civilian drivers with soldiers, and created an all-important chain of evacuation. Casualties were rushed from the battlefield to nearby dressing stations to be patched up and stabilized. Then, if necessary, moved to field hospitals, and finally to fixed hospitals in big cities for recuperation. Trains played an important role in evacuation, as did riverboats, which were transformed into state-of-the-art floating hospitals that evacuated 150,000 men. Most importantly, Letterman put medical officers in control of supplies, so that they no longer had to beg for wagons, bandages, and men.
He put all of this together in a way to run a medical department under medical control to support the commander, the soldier, and the war. Everything that Letterman looked at, all of his changes, all of his innovations are routine now, and they were not routine then.
Letterman's revolutionary system was first put to the test in Antietam in 1862. On a battlefield that stretched 6 miles, every wounded Union man was treated within 36 hours. By war's end, casualties were reached in half a day. Bloody as it was, the Civil War marked the birth of modern, organized combat medicine. The transition would prove vital as war entered a new global stage. World War I dwarfed the Civil War in scale of combat and casualties. New weapons created a degree of slaughter inconceivable in previous epics. But the devastation would have been much worse had not the war brought modern medicine to the battlefield. Germ-free surgeries, pioneering new drugs, X-ray technology, and blood transfusion. In addition, the First World War raised popular awareness of combat medicine to a new high and marked the arrival of a new kind of soldier, a soldier who did not carry a weapon.
World War I gives us our modern image of the enlisted medical soldier, corpsman, medic, call him what you will. For the first time in a significant war, enlisted medical personnel are assigned not in the safety of the hospital and the ambulance train, but with the infantry far forward to take care of the wounded.
Their job, treating men where they fell, in the muddy wasteland between the trenches known as no man's land, was full of hazard.
The mud, the gore, machine gun bullets and gas, all there. Your task is to go out, ankle deep sometimes in mud, pick up the wounded, drag them, carry them back to the safety of the trench. It's an almost impossible job, and medics die in disproportionate numbers.
Occasionally, the trenches were rigged with trolleys to transport the wounded. Most of the time, however, litter bearers hauled them through mud, snow, mountains, and other torturous terrain. Casualties were brought to first aid bunkers, often burrowed out of cliffs and packed with sandbags, or improvised in churches. A fleet of ambulances rushed the severely wounded to hospitals. Cars were useless on much of the terrain, and 83 different kinds of ambulance were employed, everything from horse-drawn wagon to tank-like armored car. Trench life itself produced many casualties.
Think about living in a hole in the ground, month after month. It rains, it snows, you're cold, you're wet. Living in the trench is the worst of your nightmare of camping, magnified by days and weeks of doing it with other people.
The unending cold and wet produced a debilitating condition known as trench foot, and the heavily manured trench soil gave off a foul gas that infected wounds and led to deadly gangrene. Adding to the difficulties, a new weapon and a new ordeal for medical personnel: man-made poison gas. The Germans were the first to use gas, releasing a cloud of chlorine outside the French village of Ypres on April 22, 1915. The fumes killed nearly 1,000 men within minutes.
It was a terror weapon. People saw it, they saw their friends falling down from it. They simply panicked and ran. People who stayed and tried to fight on obviously got the casualties, and the burning of the eyes, the burning of the mouth and in the chest, and eventually the accumulation of fluid in the lungs that led to death.
Gas masks worn by animals as well as men were the primary defense against this insidious new threat. Gassed soldiers had to be scrubbed down as quickly as possible, and special ambulances were rigged with shower units to speed the process. But the new weapon was sickeningly effective, blinding thousands and accounting for 1/3 of all casualties during the war. Mustard gas, which remained active in clothes and equipment for months, was especially debilitating. The First World War, with its unique horrors, also marked the appearance, in alarming numbers, of a new kind of casualty, a psychological casualty.
You're just worn out by the tension of hour-by-hour fear, terror, danger, seeing your buddies killed. Patients began to break psychically. They simply couldn't function. They would break down and cry. They would scream. They would stare off in what became called the 1,000-yard stare.
Eventually, shell shock, as it was called, was recognized as a war disease, and soldiers with wounded psyches were evacuated along with the physically wounded men. Despite the gruesome scale of mutilation and death, World War I was a turning point in the history of battlefield medicine. On average, wounded men were brought to field hospitals within 5 hours, and if necessary, to better equipped fixed hospitals in 10. X-ray machines, sometimes portable, were used on a mass scale for the first time, helping surgeons avoid unnecessary operations. The germ theory and antisepsis paved the way for modern hygiene, and patients no longer had to fear hospitals and infection. Mobile laboratories tested bacteria along the front, and a pioneering generation of inoculations helped keep a host of historic plagues under control. World War I was the first war in history in which microbes did not kill more men than weapons. One positive outgrowth of the butchery of this war was plastic surgery. Exploding artillery produced an unprecedented number of gruesome facial injuries. At first, wounded men were fitted with lifelike masks to cover up blown-off noses, lips, and eyes. But the epidemic of disfigurement provided a laboratory for surgeons who developed groundbreaking procedures for facial reconstruction, and by war's end, a new field of medicine had been forged. An American surgeon by the name of Oswald Robertson was responsible for a more critical breakthrough. While treating men on the front in France, he improvised the world's first blood bank.
He collected universal donor blood into glass bottles. He stored these in a wooden box that he built out of 2 ammunition cases and filled the space in between with sawdust, put a biscuit tin in the middle and punched holes in it and filled it full of ice, and dragged 22 bottles of blood that he'd collected from recovering casualties and people around the hospital forward to a British clearing station.
Robertson gave the blood to a group of 20 soldiers who had been triaged as expectant, that is, expected to die. 9 of them lived, and the new weapon of blood banking and combat transfusion was born. It was a weapon that would be put to the test on a massive scale in the next World War. The influenza epidemic of 1918, which killed over 20 million people around the world, swept through the trenches of France and immobilized armies on every side. Battlefield medicine will continue in a moment on Modern Marvels. A single generation after the First World War ended, a Second World War began. Once again, there was a quantum leap in the technology of death. But combat medicine also benefited from new weapons and tactics. From Guadalcanal to the beaches of Normandy, in surgical tents and improvised hospitals, medics and doctors reached wounded men faster and more effectively than ever before. One of the symbols of military medicine in World War II was plasma. Whole blood transfusion, pioneered during the First World War, was still considered impractical on a mass scale because blood spoiled easily and was difficult to store. But plasma, liquid blood minus the red blood cells, could be freeze-dried and canned, carried easily, and used to keep hemorrhaging men alive.
The use of plasma for initial treatment of shock saved any number of lives. Corpsman could give it right up front. Didn't have to be refrigerated. You had a tin can, you took it apart, you put the water into the lyophilized plasma, you swirled it around, you stuck in the IV thing, and you gave it to the guy.
Unfortunately, plasma had some serious, if little publicized, defects. Unlike whole blood, plasma was pooled, and before long the entire supply was contaminated with hepatitis. In mid-war, after tens of thousands of soldiers came down with the disease, the Army decided to switch from plasma to blood. Charles Drew, a leading expert on blood banking, was given the crucial task of developing a nationwide blood banking system overnight.
What Drew did was an enormous accomplishment because it had never been done before, where strangers came in to give blood to strangers in advance of anyone needing the blood. But now you have thousands of people, for patriotic reasons, coming in to give blood for soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that they'll never see.
Ironically, the blood that Charles Drew, a black man, collected was racially segregated by the military.
No white person should have Negro blood. That was a given, not arguable. Red Cross fought it tooth and nail. Drew fought it tooth and nail, and they lost.
It was not blood banking, but penicillin and other advances in disease control that had the biggest impact on combat medicine in World War II. The development of antibiotics wiped out the kind of bacterial infections that had crippled armies since ancient times. DDT, hailed as a miracle disinfectant, was sprayed everywhere as part of a massive campaign to kill mosquitoes and other disease-carrying pests. Atibran, a malaria suppressant, was also enormously effective, and taking a pill was part of every jungle soldier's daily regimen. Morphine, available in single-dose syrettes that could be administered by medics on the battlefield, also came to the fore. To avoid overdosage, medics noted each injection on a medical history card. Sometimes overdosage was deliberate. Don McKee, a D-Day medic on the beaches of Normandy, woke up one morning to find his supply kit opened.
I said, uh-oh, what's happened? Somebody had gotten the morphine syrettes out of my patch and proceeded to punch himself with about 20 of these. He overdosed, is what he did. Crawled back in his hole and he was dead. And I really felt bad because this poor guy had just had too much of combat and he wanted out of there. And the best way you do was get into the medic's pouch and take my morphine.
Psychological breakdown, combat fatigue as it was now called, was an even bigger problem than in the First World War. 1 out of every 6 casualties was psychological, 600,000 in all, broken by the brutality of war.
I can't stand seeing people get killed in that way all my life. I can't kill anyone either.
This Army footage shows World War II GIs in various states of breakdown and shock. This severely traumatized man is trying desperately to speak and can't. This man's best friend was disemboweled by a shell fragment. He believes he is still on the battlefield. Reassurance and a few days of rest and relaxation brought most emotionally shocked GIs back from the edge, and 60% were able to return to the fight. Remarkably, medics and surgeons on the front lines did not themselves frequently crack. George Sharp was a 25-year-old doctor fresh out of med school when he was sent to the Philippines as a battalion surgeon. As the first doctor to see a wounded man, Sharp was positioned within 100 yards of the fighting.
At times, there was a very heavy flow of casualties. I would see as many as 100 or more men coming in a day, and I couldn't change my clothes. My clothes were covered with blood. And my operating room, so-called, was a hole dug deep for my feet to sit down, and I would work on these people as they came in. We were under fire. We were getting mortars dropped near us, and we were getting shells from the Japanese. The din was absolutely horrendous. I mean, you have no concept of the din. And at times, it would stop suddenly, and it would be an absolute silence, a haunting silence. And then it would start up again. We had very primitive conditions. I didn't have any sterilization of gloves. I used a helmet full of bichloride of mercury, and I dipped my hands into that, and then plunged my hands maybe into somebody's abdomen.
One of the most daunting challenges facing combat medics came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, as the greatest invasion force ever assembled stormed the beaches of Normandy.
Everybody has an image in their mind of soldiers charging out of boats into artillery, mines, and machine guns, being blown apart and damaged, and they were. Somebody has to get these people to safety. That somebody is the medic.
Don McKee was a medic with the 29th Infantry Division, one of 5 assault divisions that made up the D-Day Armada.
During the assault on June the 6th, we were on board ship 4 or 5 miles out, and we could see that they were having a lot of trouble. And many of the landing craft were flooded as they came in, and when the ramps were open and people poured out of the front of them, they immediately stepped into water over their head. Most of these infantry people were carrying 75 and 80 pounds of materials on their back, and a lot of them didn't make it. When we got to the beach was still in chaos, and those bodies were floating in, and you literally had to step over many people that were already dead. Once you got on the beach and you got a few people together in the shelter of the cliff, you were able to help some people.
McKee, one of 2 medics in a company of 200 GIs, treated as many as 30 men a day.
You had to make a decision, and only the medic could make it. Is it safe to go out and try to pull that fellow back? But I had to do it on several occasions. But you couldn't treat him out in the middle of the gunfire. You just had to drag him back, and I had many people firing at me, and unfortunately they missed. The wounds that I basically saw were either puncture wounds from small arms fire or shrapnel. And now and then you'd run into somebody that had a direct hit of a mortar or an artillery shell. All you could do was stop the arterial bleeding, but I had many men die right while I was there because I had no way of saving them.
Less than a year after D-Day came another decisive day, one that would cast a sobering shadow over the future of mankind, subsequent wars, and the role of combat medicine. Korea is in many ways America's forgotten war. But from the point of view of military medicine, Korea was a turning point.
Korea's death rate of wounded is 2% less than half of World War II, a milestone in military medicine.
There were 2 reasons for this extraordinary success. The first was the helicopter used to evacuate casualties for the first time. Only 2 men could be medevaced at a time in these pioneering craft, placed in pods on either side of the chopper. More importantly, Korea brought to reality something that had long seemed a fantasy, a movable hospital that could follow the fight, and that came to be known as MASH.
MASH in Korea was the culmination of forward surgical care. Larey, Letterman, World War I, World War II, all of that came together, and it was said, we need a structured hospital, appropriately staffed with about 80 beds, to be far forward as we can get it, and that was the MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital.
The MASH's great contribution is it provides an entire hospital unit that can continue to move forward in tents, in jeeps. The MASH can keep pace with the Army, and patients are moved backwards as they become more transportable and stable.
Evacuate the man in the rear to where we can get him out on a chopper. Do you understand? Over.
By the early 1960s, another war in Southeast Asia.
Burning. They're going to do all they can to save that leg.
I know. I know there's not much left because I was carrying that damn thing in my hands all the way back. I was afraid the whole thing was going to come off.
Vietnam, a different kind of war, brought a different approach to combat medicine. The revolutionary premise of the 18th century Frenchman Dominique Jean Larrey to treat casualties as close to the front line as possible was not practical in a war where there was no clearly defined front line, and where speedy ground evacuation through rice paddy and jungle was impossible. Instead, U.S. planners built a network of 28 hospitals throughout Vietnam and relied almost entirely on a new kind of ambulance to airlift men from jungle patch to hospital bed.
The Navy's medical men say the fabulous helicopter is a vital factor in giving battle-wounded men a better chance for survival.
Huey helicopters carried 90% of the casualties during the war. It took a crew less than a minute to load between 6 to 9 wounded GIs and an average of 35 minutes to get them to a hospital. The survival rate of airlifted soldiers was 98%.
Now in Korea, patients sometimes would be picked up at the battalion aid station. In Vietnam, the helicopter came right down into the infantry action where the man was wounded, loaded him aboard and left. The medic with the unit had started treatment. The medic on the helicopter could continue it, and usually within 30 minutes, this patient is in an 400-bed evacuation hospital, which is kind of like Walter Reed moved to Vietnam.
Hank Toole was a pilot with the 1st Cavalry Division who flew hundreds of medevac missions in 1969.
When you got a call to go in and pick up someone in combat, it was normally not because they were sick, it was because they were wounded. And if they were wounded, then there was probably enemy activity. So you could kind of count on the fact that you were going to run into some kind of hostile action. I think we all had 20, 30, 40, 50 times that you had bullet holes. Some people wounded, some killed.
By far the most dangerous medevac sorties were the hoist missions, in which a Huey would hover over a combat zone and pull up casualties by cable.
You would drop the cable down and hover above the trees, and they would take the patients and put them on their litter, and then we would hoist them up. And we would always try to turn the tail of the airplane to the enemy, so if they were going to shoot, we had something between us and them. Sometimes it was just hard to do that, and you had to do a hoist where you're looking out the windshield, and you could actually, at times, see them coming out of bunker complexes or raising up to shoot at you, and you can't do much but smile.
Sometimes the hostile fire was so intense that Toole had to make an agonizing decision.
You got people below you. If you wait too long, you could fall on them and hurt them, kill them all. You got a patient on the hoist, so if you can punch him and drop him, or you can pull him up through the trees. You're sitting there at a time where you're kind of stressed anyway, with people shooting at you and the radios go on, and you're trying to make a decision. Where do we go? How far do we push it before we blow the hoist or before we pull out?
A medic flew on all Huey missions, along with a co-pilot, a gunner, and a crew chief. Tom Eagles, a monastery student in Vietnam in the early 60s, joined the Marine Corps in 1968 and flew medevacs as a corpsman for over a year.
Well, it scared the hell out of you, because when the horn went off, you ran out to the helicopter, you jumped on, and your fate was sealed. Sometimes the Marines were pinned down, they couldn't get up to bring the patient, so you ran out there and grabbed the patient yourself. You ran across the rice paddy with all this equipment on you, and you ran out there and grabbed this guy and ran back to the chopper and threw him up in there, and you crawled up in there. Sometimes you get to him, sometimes you couldn't. Sometimes they were so wounded, you couldn't get to all of them. I mean, those were days they died. I mean, you saw people die because you couldn't get to them and take care of this guy and that guy, too. Those days will, choke you up for the rest of your life.
The North Vietnamese, like the Japanese before them, were not signatories to the Geneva Convention that protected medics and other non-combatants. Tom Eagles, who also spent a lot of time on the ground with the troops, was a so-called gunslinger doc, a medic who carried a weapon and also ignored the Geneva Accords.
The Geneva Convention says you shouldn't carry a weapon for other than your protection or the patient's protection. But if you don't carry a weapon, then you're a liability to the rest of the soldiers and Marines around you. We thought this was preventive medicine. Kill them before they kill you. In a small unit, you had to pull your load.
Combat medicine, of course, cuts across battle lines. The North Vietnamese were also doing everything they could to treat their wounded, in many ways against greater odds. There was no medevac for the Viet Cong. Instead, they carried casualties long distances on jungle trails. With little money for equipment and machines, they lived off American scrap. These surgical tools were fashioned from the aluminum of a downed plane. Operating rooms without X-ray, blood banking, or electricity were set up in tunnels and caves. This primitive foot-powered pump that suctioned out fluids during surgery saved many lives. In battlefield medicine, as in everything else, there are the haves and the have-nots. After Vietnam, many countries of the Third World would find that taking care of the wounded was a luxury they still could not afford. Where does an Army surgeon get trained? In inner-city emergency rooms, where he treats knife, gunshot, and other casualties of the urban battlefield. Modern marvels will return. The Gulf War against Iraq in 1991 was a military medical catastrophe waiting to happen. The American-led front raced across the desert at 50 miles per hour, the fastest moving front of all time. Too fast, as it turned out, for the medical support troops who needed 32 hours to carry portable hospitals and other cumbersome equipment into Iraq.
If we would have had a lot of casualties during Desert Storm, it would have been a disaster. I mean, it really would have been a disaster.
The Army's #1 medical priority after the war was to improve mobility so that hospitals and doctors could keep up with the front. To that end, the Army has developed a hospital that can be dropped in a box by parachute and assembled by 4 men in half an hour.
What we wanted to do is to develop a hospital that was very light and had all the capabilities of a big, heavy hospital. You can do almost any general surgical procedure or whatever you need to do, and up to 2 dozen, 3 dozen operations in 24 hours.
Since the 19th century, progress in battlefield medicine has been dramatic. In the Civil War, 20 to 30% of those who received treatment died. By Vietnam, 98% survived. But the statistics are somewhat misleading.
We have not made any progress in the last 150 years in terms of decreasing those soldiers or Marines who were killed in action. Killed in action means that people would die before they would arrive in a hospital. In Vietnam, the percent was still 20%, which was the same as it was in Civil War. But I feel that we need to concentrate how to reduce that.
Most soldiers die in the first hour after being wounded, the so-called golden hour when resuscitation is possible. With that in mind, medical researchers have developed a slew of high-tech tools that they hope will allow medics, doctors, and soldiers themselves to render treatment in the midst of battle. One such tool is called an LSTAT, and it's the first significant redesign of a stretcher since ancient times.
Up till now, we have not attempted to deliver critical care during the evacuation process because it was so life support equipment intensive. This facility gives us that new capability to provide that en route care.
What this stretcher really does is bring an intensive care unit onto the battlefield. Miniaturized within a 120-pound, 5-inch thick frame that can fit into an ambulance is all the life support hardware of a big city hospital, including ventilator, oxygen generator, defibrillator, and physiological monitors. Another dramatic development in battlefield medicine has to do with bandages. The bandage has been around more or less unchanged since the Trojan War, but the Red Cross, working with the Army, has come up with a gauze that can stop out-of-control bleeding in a minute. It's called a fibrin bandage, and it uses high doses of scab-producing proteins to form an instant scab.
The fibrin bandage will allow you to apply and achieve almost immediate hemostasis on very large wounds, where just the amount of blood that's lost through oozing very quickly adds up to represent devastating losses.
An aerosol version of the bandage is also being developed for hard-to-treat wounds.
You can't stuff a 4x4 bandage through a .30 caliber bullet hole. So if you could have something that looked like a WD-40 can with a long nozzle on it, sit it in and let it expand 50 times its volume, creating a local material that as the lung moved inside, it would spread it around.
Okay, Mark, help's on the way.
Other futuristic combat medical tools include a personal status monitor to be worn by every soldier like a watch that shoots vital sign and location information to medical personnel. Telepresence surgery, which promises to one day bring the best surgeons from around the world into a foxhole by remote control. Researchers are also working on a so-called hibernation or suspended animation drug that will slow down the body metabolism of seriously wounded men until they can be evacuated and helped.
The idea is to slow down death, so to speak. A turtle, for example, that requires oxygen, can get underwater and stay there for 6 months because it can decrease its metabolic rate 200-fold. I mean, it's amazing. And so the thought was, why not look at what is it about the turtle or other animals that can go into hibernation?
Combat medicine, of course, is not just an American endeavor. And it's not just something that's done with helicopters and state-of-the-art science. In Afghanistan, Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia, and other under-publicized war zones, volunteer medics, nurses, and surgeons provide a different, desperate kind of frontline health care.
We don't belong to a military, but we treat many of the victims of war. I think the combat medics probably focus most of their attention on their own people. I don't think they spend a lot of time with civilians. If they happen to see 1 or 2 civilians, they might treat them. But we're there for everyone, everyone. We're there for the Faction A and Faction B, and we're there for the civilians.
Mary Lightfine is a nurse with Doctors Without Borders, a humanitarian organization that treats soldiers and other victims of war in 83 countries around the world.
A lot of the war wounded we see would be bomb blasts, landmines, burns, torture victims. In northern Uganda, I saw many women who had stepped on landmines, blew off their leg, and they lost their pregnancy as a result. Sometimes it makes you sad. You're overwhelmed. You go to the countries to help people, and you see there's so much to do. And you can't do everything. So you feel good to help them, but you feel sad that you can't help everyone. It's so hard to watch them die and to know there's so many thousands of them. You can't possibly save all of them.
The best battlefield medicine, of course, is preventative. Looking at images of the wounded in war after war, the mutilation and suffering, it becomes obvious that war itself is a plague that has afflicted mankind since ancient times. If combat medicine could only find an antidote to that sickness. Until it does, the great paradoxical race on the battlefield between mutilating and patching up, taking life and saving life, matching our genius for slaughter against our mastery of healing, will be ongoing.